Alright, so today we're learning about the linear equation and how it applies to the linear graph. Okay, so the linear equation, an equation is something with an equal sign in it. So there it is. And a linear equation, see the word line in there, means that it's going to actually be a straight line when we graph it. Now there's some things that are really important about this, and it's these two things. Okay, so the m, we say that that's the coefficient of x. The coefficient means it's the number in front of x. Okay, so we have an x there and we have a number in front, like 6. 6 would be the coefficient of x. M is also the gradient. So when we graph this line, m will be the gradient. And a gradient is just the slope. Okay, so we can call the gradient the slope. So for anybody who goes skiing, if you go on a really hard run, an advanced run, then you'll be going down a really steep mountain. That's something that's got a really high gradient, okay? You might be on a really beginner's run and it might have a gradient like this, not much slope at all. That's a really low gradient. Okay, now the other thing here that's important is this part here. Now this will just be a number. Okay, we call it the constant term. The word constant means it's just a number. There's no x with it, there's no letter with it. It's just a number. And that number ends up being the y-intercept on our graph. That means it's where the graph, or the straight line, where it cuts the y-axis, where it crosses the y-axis. Okay, so let's see how this lesson will work. All right, so in the first part here, we're looking at trying to actually identify the coefficient of x and the constant term. So if we look at this first one, we have y equals a half x minus 3. So the coefficient of x, remember, is the number in front of x. So we've got to find the x first, there it is, and then look at the number in front. The number in front is a half. So the coefficient of x is a half. Now, for the constant term in this equation, we're looking for a number that appears by itself, and that's this one here. Now, it's not just 3, it's minus 3. The sign is really important. Okay, it's going to make a big difference to our answers, so make sure the negative is there. All right, now in the second equation, we have this. We're looking for the coefficient of x, so let's find x first. There it is. We want the number in front of x. Well, in front of that x, all I see is a minus. I can't see any number. But you know that if there's a number missing, it's a 1. So get your red pen and write a 1 in there. So now you can see that the number in front of x is minus 1. So the coefficient of x is minus 1. The constant term is the number all by itself. That's this one, positive 6, which we know we can just write as 6. Okay, now the next part of the work, we're looking at parallel lines. So parallel lines, you've seen those before in parallelograms. Anything where the lines go forever and never touch each other are parallel lines. So if you look at a railway track, the two lines on either side of the railway track are parallel. Okay, so parallel lines have the same gradient. So if you look at this diagram here, that's got a particular slope or a particular gradient. I'm going to call that gradient M1, M for gradient. And this other line here is drawn parallel to it, and I'm going to call its gradient M2. So if these two lines are parallel, then the gradients are equal. So the gradient of this line is exactly the same as the gradient of that line. You can imagine skiing down this slope and skiing down this slope, and it would feel the same, because the gradient's the same. Okay, now over here we're looking at positive gradient and negative gradient. Okay, so the positive gradient has a line that looks like that. So I've written M for gradient, that's our symbol, don't forget that. M is positive, our gradient is positive. So a line with a positive gradient increases as you look at it from left to right. So if we look from left to right at this line, it's going up. It's increasing. And this one here, the negative gradient, a line with a negative gradient decreases as you look at it from left to right. So if we look across this way, you can see our line is going down. It's decreasing. Okay, so over here we're going to do a little bit of revision on all the things we've just learnt. So hopefully you can see all that. I might just move it over slightly. Okay. All right, so let's have a look. We're going to be filling in the blanks here. All right, so the first one says the equations of parallel lines have the same what? Remember what we said? Parallel lines, they have the same gradient. So fill it in with your red pen. Okay, the next one. Linear equations with the same constant term have graphs that have the same what? Now, we haven't really talked too much about it, but we did write it back here in the notes. Right, so the constant term is the y-intercept. Okay, so back here it says linear equations with the same constant term have graphs that have the same y-intercept. Okay, the next one. Linear equations with a negative coefficient of x. There's a lot to read here, but think about it. Linear equations, just the equations we've been looking at, with a negative coefficient of x have graphs that are what? All right, now remember the coefficient of x is the gradient. So they're just trying to confuse you, aren't they? So let's have a look at it again. Linear equations with a negative gradient, they could have said, not coefficient of x. That's a lot of words, isn't it? So linear equations with a negative gradient have graphs that are what? Well, here was the negative gradient. What were they doing? Decreasing. Okay, next one. The equations of lines with the same y-intercept have the same what? All right, so remember, what's a y-intercept again? Constant term. So they have the same constant term. Just keep looking back at our notes. Okay, next one. The equations of lines that are decreasing have a what coefficient of x? So here's the lines that are decreasing. Remember, if they were decreasing, they have a negative gradient, negative gradient, negative gradient, negative coefficient of x. Okay, so they've got coefficient of x. We're going to fill in the word negative. So I know there's a lot of words in this, and it really is testing your literacy, but it's a good revision of all the stuff we've just been speaking about. So come back in the next video and we'll do a bit more practice with this.